Hey everyone, Tactics here, where in this video I'll be taking a look at the state of tanks in Season 4 of Dragonflight, discussing where I think each spec stands and how the meta looks to be shaking out based on PTR testing. It is important to note that this is still all subject to change, since we currently haven't received any word on spec tuning going into the new season, which may or may not happen, so just be aware things could be different based on if that does end up happening. If you're interested in tank gearing going into Season 4, I'm going to be releasing a video going over all the new dinar system, the weapons, trinkets, all those kinds of things, very rare items. So make sure to subscribe to the channel, notifications on. And now let's start off with the elephant in the room, Vengeance Demon Hunter. It is no secret, VDH has been extremely dominant since its rework going into patch 10.2, and if you're wondering if that's going to change moving into Season 4, the answer is most likely no. Double sigils just give them an insane amount of stops, and it is a season where a lot of the dungeons have had a reduction in the amount of interruptible spells that exist, but instead increasing the amount of stoppable spells. So while that reduces the value of Silence Sigil a little bit, it definitely increases the value of some of their other stops, where they have Chaos Nova, they've got double Misery Sigils, double Chain Sigils, things like that. So they still have a ton of utility to bring to a group. Plus, of course, they have that Chaos brand, which really complements what is looking to be another caster meta from the DPS side of things, making VDH the highest damage tank spec when that is factored in, especially when something like Havoc, which is the only other spec that can bring that, doesn't look like it's going to be strong enough to actually take one of those DPS slots to provide that same debuff. The durability is also nothing to scoff at. They may not be the tankiest tank in the game right now, but they have all the tools to get them through any situation when played correctly, and with all that mob lockdown on top of it, they're solid. They're not going to have any issues there. They do have two main issues, the first being threat, particularly when you're grouping up larger pulls, or if you have specs that do big burst in your group, such as Devastation Evoker, which is trying to peek its way into the meta. Not sure if that's going to actually happen, but it is one of those big scary burst specs that could give Vengeance some problems. Second issue is getting yourself established. I'm sure everyone has seen the classic VDH jumps into a pack and instantly dies. It's happened to me before, and I'm not too proud to admit it, but once you do get past those first few globals, assuming you're able to, and you can ramp up your frailty and your painbringer stacks, you're usually able to stay in packs without any problems almost indefinitely, assuming you rotate through all those little tools we mentioned earlier properly. It is just getting in there and getting those first few globals, especially in those bigger pulls, that's going to take some finessing and kind of going to separate the good VDHs from the bad ones. Now, the question on everyone's mind, how could they possibly balance this spec? I think the big thing is removing double utility sigil specifically. I don't think you should remove double sigil of flame and maybe even double Elysian Decree. Double sigil of flame really helps that playstyle, right? However, double utility sigils is probably something long term that just can't remain in the game. Now, is anything going to happen going into Season 4? If you look back, for anyone that remembers Shadowlands, we had a similar problem with Blood DK and how dominant they were in Season 3 moving into Season 4, and nothing really happened to them. So I'm not too hopeful we're going to see anything significant happen to Vengeance either. So if I had to guess, they're going to remain the top tank. But moving into War Within, I think something definitely has to happen to double utility sigils. It's just way too much control from a single player, a single role, a single spec, and there's just no way other tanks can match that, and I'm not sure other tanks should be able to match it. There's always the argument that, oh, just buff every other tank to make them the same level as Vengeance Demon Hunter, and I think specifically when talking about utility sigils, I don't know if that's the play. Sure, it would be great to have that much control on every tank, but then all of a sudden, you know, the amount of stops and interrupts and whatever in a dungeon has to increase to compensate, because all of a sudden tanks are just soloing all the abilities, and then it just gets into a place that I don't think anyone wants it to be. So I'd much rather them prune back on this kind of utility, and then also at the same time do things like they're actually doing next season, like removing interrupts from mobs, making abilities stoppable, adding cooldowns to spells, making spells have longer cooldowns, all things they're doing in this coming season, which are really good, and I think something that should continue to happen, especially if they do peel back on the double utility sigils. Now, I think below Vengeance, there are two tanks that are looking to be a bit above the rest of the field. The first of which is Guardian Druids. Output-wise, I put Guardian Druid in the top 3 for both damage and survivability, but I do think they don't really have anything that lets them do things that no other tank spec can, kind of like Vengeance Demon Hunter and their sigils. The one thing they do have is their ability to do massive group healing during large AoE pulls, thanks to After the Wildfire, which certainly does come in handy in certain dungeons where a lot of random damage is being thrown out in the trash, like Algathar Academy and Brackenhide Hollow, or if you're pulling trash onto bosses, like in Uldaman. But in terms of actually enabling something over other tanks, I don't think there's a big advantage there. Something I've also heard a lot is people saying that Bear is weak to magic and bleed damage, which is a myth that for some reason just still continues to be thrown around. It's just not true though. Bears have a ton of flat DRs, absorbs, and self-healing in their kit, which makes them solid against all damage types. Hell, Bear was the meta tank in Season 2, which was full of spam cast magic tank busters and stacking bleeds, and Bears did just fine. So that is not something that really is to be worried about at all. The real issue for Bears, I think, is that Resto Druid is very strong in its own right now, which hurts because you now have another very viable source of that Mark of the Wild buff, plus the Druid utility kit, since Guardians don't have anything that Resto can't bring. Again, to bring it back to the Vengeance example, Vengeance has access to all of those sigils and 2 charges of them. Havoc does not, right? Havoc does not have the same kind of level of sigil utility, and they can't get 2 of them, so that's kind of a new thing Vengeance brings. Guardian to Resto Druid does not have that same disparity in utility, so Resto Druid can bring literally everything I think that Guardian can. I don't think there's really anything unique unless you're counting like regrowth procs or anything like that, but that's not really great at all. So anything Guardian can do, Resto Druid can do as well. So if that's a really, really strong spec right now, if that's looking like the meta healer, that drastically takes away from the benefit Guardian provides. Now, I had someone actually come into my stream and ask, what could Guardian have buffed to bring them up to the level of VDH? And this is actually an interesting thing I try to think about for a few of the other tank specs. It takes a lot, I think. I think the biggest thing is if you look at all of the War Within Lunar Beam buffs that come in the Guardian of a Loon Tree, if you just added all those in naturally to Lunar Beam and then also made it a 6-second silence, maybe then you could talk about Guardian and VDH in the same kind of conversation, but even that might not be enough. So it's kind of funny that, again, just trying to illustrate the disparity between mob control and utility like that in the current kind of tank environment is a little funny for sure. Now, the other top tank here should be no surprise, that is Prot Paladin. In terms of unique utility here, no other tank can lock down an individual caster like Prot Paladin, and on top of that, they have the best external defensives and on-demand off healing of any tank spec, meaning if the name of the game is helping your team survive, these guys excel. They're also moving away from the heavily consecrate focused tier set, which I think will cause all paladins to breathe a sigh of relief, instead going back to their Vault of the Incarnates tier, which is a nice 8% verse boost both of themselves and their nearest ally, so that's a nice DPS boost for your group. Now, I did mention that there has been a move away from interrupts and towards stops in a lot of the dungeons on the PTR, and that definitely does hurt Prot Paladin a little bit since they are lacking a bit in the stop department, heavily focused more on using those Avenger shields to silence mobs, but you'll definitely still be able to get value of that in most pulls. Unlike Guardian Druids, there isn't a major competition spec right now for Prot Paladin. Ret is solid for sure, but it's currently just outside the meta for DPS specs, I think. And even if they were meta, they don't bring things like the interrupt potential or things like spell warding that Prot does. So again, there's some unique utility they have there and a unique spot for them. And they're probably the closest in terms of having that totally unique spot to Vengeance Demon Hunter out of all the tanks. Then we have the remaining 3 tank specs, which I really want to emphasize aren't bad in any sense. Historically, final patches have always been when tanks across the board feel the best, and I think this is no exception here. Every single tank spec is going to feel the most powerful they've been all expansion, and I could totally see an argument for these last 3 tank specs to be kind of in any order here. This one's better for this reason, this one's worse for this reason, etc., etc. For me, though, my sleeper pick at the bottom here is Prot Warrior. A lot of people seem to forget that Warriors were the tank in Season 1 up until Prot Paladins got reworked, and while they did get nerfed throughout Season 1, they got more than compensated through buffs all throughout Season 2, plus they also now have a significantly better tier set. The real problem Prot Warriors face, compared to other tanks, is just the complete and utter lack of real utility. On top of that, everything that they do have is basically just strictly worse than something another tank has. Disrupting Shout is just worse Silent Sigil, Shockwave is worse Leg Sweep, Stormbelt is worse Hammer of Justice, and Intimidating Shout is just worse insert any AoE stop here. Now, none of this really matters if throughput-wise, Prout Warrior is just the best option, but unfortunately right now, it isn't. Especially with it looking like, again, a caster meta where Battle Shout isn't really giving you any value. In terms of unique niche, again, they are a bit lacking in this department. The biggest tool they've got is Spell Reflect, and while this is extremely good in a few dungeons like Noku Defensive and Azure Vault, I don't think it's enough to make them even a niche pick here like they were back in Season 2 for Neltharian's Lair. On its own, though, I think the spec does feel great to play. It's the greatest felt all expansion, and it's exceptionally tanky. It's just a brick house. It just needs a lot of small adjustments to kind of bring it in line with some of the other specs. I won't full rant here, but to just quickly list off some things I'd like to see outside of making Shockwave easier to access, which we know is coming in the War Within. You could double the health bonus of Rally in 5-man content. A lot of raid buffs have an increase in 5-mans because they're just not as strong. You can make Wrecking Throw the 45-second CD, kill Incorporals instead of Shattering Throw the 3-minute CD so they can actually interact with that affix. You could make Intervene also intercept spells to give them some other kind of unique niche with Spell Reflect. You could uncap Intimidating Shout because why is that capped at all? Also, Bitter Immunity. Remember that spell, guys? You could also just allow that to cleanse magic and bleed effects. That talent has literally never been picked all expansion. It needs something, for sure. I think all these changes could literally happen right now, and it still wouldn't make Prout Warrior the best tank. It wouldn't even make them move up a tier, honestly. It would just make them feel a lot better. That's really it. And that leaves us with Brewmaster and Blood DK, who have a lot of the same issues as some of the specs we've previously mentioned. As a disclaimer here, these are my two least played tank specs at the moment as well on the PTR, just because I don't think there's a good chance they're going to be meta without some massive adjustments both to themselves and other tank specs, and I don't want to spend too much time on them. I'd rather focus on tank specs that I would have the chance of playing. Looking at Brewmaster specifically, I think, again, like Guardian Druid, they have to compete with the extremely powerful Mistweaver Monk spec, who brings the exact same utility kit as them, right? At the same time, they don't have any niche. They don't have anything unique that they bring that no other spec does. For a lot of the expansion, their thing has been damage, but DH definitely crushes them in that department when you take into account Chaos Brand amping all the caster DPS specs, especially, again, Mystic Touch is losing a lot of value because of those caster DPS specs. On top of that, multiple other tank specs are beating them out in personal durability and in group survival help, so it's a bit tough there. For DK, it's a lot like Prout Warrior, where they really don't bring a lot to a 5-man group outside of some stops. AMZ is certainly better than Rally in 5-man content, and they do bring more damage than Warrior, especially with the Legendary getting an eye level boost, but just like Brewmaster, that damage still doesn't match Vengeance. I also think they're a lot riskier to play than some other tank options, because if you're looking at some higher fortified keys, you really need to plan out how you're going to safely get into packs and get yourself established, something also VDH needs to think about, but a lot of the other tank specs above them don't struggle with. And to kind of leave you guys with some food for thought, I wanted to just quickly go over a tweet by Sense, who, for those that don't know, puts out a bunch of warrior resources like the Spell Reflect document, so make sure you guys check that out. But basically, he kind of tweeted this image here, which I'll put on screen for you guys, and it's basically the amount of buffs, nerfs, and then total like talent tree shifts, new talents adjustments overall throughout the expansion. And you can really see here the tanks that were meta for a season or part of a season, and the tanks that weren't or were having issues, or especially are having issues at the end of the expansion here in this season. Death Knight, Monk, and Warrior all having significantly less changes compared to Demon Hunter, Druid, and Paladin, who all had massive shuffles in their talent tree. And I hope that this is just like some growing pains with the Dragonflight talent system. It takes some time. This is the first expansion it was introduced, so maybe it's going to take some iterations to get everything right. I'm just hoping that these specs do get some love when we finally see the War Within Alpha go live, which, again, hopefully we get the Alpha very, very soon. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, as we'll be posting everything Raid, Mythic Plus, and tank related to the new expansion. Would also love to know what spec you guys plan on playing in Season 4. Are you joining the dirty meta rerollers on VDH, or are you holding strong on something else? Let me know down in the comments below. Otherwise, big shout out to my Patreon supporters for making all of this content possible, and I'll see you all in the next video.